Ron Sakolsky, age 80. I live on Denman Island in British Columbia, but I was born in Brooklyn, New York. I basically grew up in a working class neighborhood in Sheepshead Bay in Brooklyn. And my parents were living in a rent controlled apartment. The neighborhood was primarily Jewish and Italian, ethnically, an ethnic neighborhood. And unlike what often people assume about a big city like New York, it was a very provincial upbringing because the neighborhood was very much enclosed. And I didn't really leave the neighborhood much. And a lot of the events that were happening in the larger city would have been something that I wouldn't have experienced. So a lot of what I needed to do was to, in order to get to a place where I could see beyond the confines of the neighborhood, was to actually physically leave it. And I didn't have any role models growing up that could offer me another perspective. I was basically being brought up by people who were not particularly political. I wasn't a red diaper baby or a black diaper baby. These were people who were all about upward mobility. This would have been third generation, and they wanted me to be upwardly mobile. They gave me a very Anglo-Saxon name, Ronald Barry. And that was their whole idea. You assimilate, you become part of American society, and therefore eligible for the American dream. And so that was a lot of the kind of experience I had growing up, which I took for granted. I just assumed this is the way everybody was brought up. And many of my friends in the neighborhood were brought up in that way as well. So, of course, it just seemed very natural. But in order to get beyond that and to question some of the assumptions of the American dream, I needed to leave that environment. Very much a part of that was the idea that I would do that I would eventually go off to college so that I could get a better job. It wasn't about learning in particular. It was about getting a degree so that I could increase my ability to earn a living. And those were the kinds of ways in which things were seen. So that the idea of getting a better job was the whole reason you became educated. In my case, though, when I did eventually leave high school and move on to college, it was also because I wanted to get beyond the limits of what I was being brought up with and question the larger kinds of world issues that were impinging on me and everybody else in that generation. This would have been in the 60s. And into the 70s, of course. So I needed to expand my horizons. And also I had the draft breathing down my neck. So this was the time of the Vietnam War. If I was to go to college, I would be eligible for a deferment from the draft. And that was very clearly the path that I wanted to go. It seemed like a way of satisfying my parents who wanted to send me to college and satisfying my own survival needs and political ways of seeing the world, and not having to fight in the Vietnam War, not risk being killed or having to kill anybody. So those kinds of basic assumptions were the ones that I operated off of. It wasn't so much a sophisticated understanding of anarchism, or a sophisticated critique of capitalism, but it was very personal. So the idea was I was not going to be in a situation where I was in any way part of the Vietnam War. And the easiest way to accomplish that was to dodge the draft. And I was prepared to do other things if necessary, if that didn't work out. So that was a big part of the whole impetus that got me into college. Once I got into college, I met other people like myself, some of whom were coming from backgrounds like mine and wanting to expand their understanding of things and wanting to act against the kinds of things that were causing, things like the Vietnam War and things that I would be exposed to even as a child would eventually lead me to kind of understanding the broader world outside of my neighborhood. So that my father, who was a postal worker and also worked as a janitor for the Child Welfare League of America, had he owned no property to so to speak of. We lived in a rent-controlled apartment, but his one piece of property that he was very proud of and attached to was his automobile. He liked to drive. And so he liked to take the family on vacations. He was very conscientious about that, and he was a provider. And we went on one of these vacations, we drove down to Florida from New York. And this was the time of racial segregation being in full force in the South. We drove through the South, we drove on the back roads, and we didn't drive on the superhighway. Now, obviously, racial segregation existed in the North, too. In the big cities, it was de facto. It wasn't as much in your face as it was down South. But we were able to, I was able to have an experience that was very jarring because I saw the fact that people were told they could only use certain restrooms, drink from certain water fountains that were colored only, and so on. And later on, as I got older, and the TV images started appearing on screen of the resistance going on to that kind of segregated life on the part of the civil rights movement. And I saw people, sitting in at lunch counters and doing the kinds of things that involve mass demonstrations in the street, and the Freedom Riders who went down there by bus, and all the people who were protesting that. I made that connection early on, and I saw that there was resistance to that. And I wanted to be connected to that resistance, just as I wanted to be connected to the resistance in Vietnam. And then, of course, eventually, since I was living in New York, I had the opportunity to actually hear Malcolm X speak a couple of times, and that blew me away. I mean, I'm 80 years old, and he's the most amazing public speaker I've ever heard in my life. And not only what he said as a speaker, but also his response to questions. So I was able to put the whole Black liberation struggle in connection to some of my earliest childhood experiences. My parents, when they went down south as part of that same trip, they really didn't give me any political analysis of what was happening. So that could only come later. My mother was very afraid because she thought, oh, we have a New York City license plate, and we're going to be targeted, and we're Jewish, and some of these people don't like Jews either. And my father was also concerned about, being stopped by the cops. Those concerns were very much connected to who they were, but they never really addressed my questions about why segregation was happening. And that only came later. And that came through my understanding of things as I got involved with people who had a direct sort of experience with that. And I didn't have that in my neighborhood, but I eventually became involved at the college level with people who did. And so that was an eye-opener for me. And that was certainly one of the gateways for me. So I saw the two threads of the Vietnam War and the resistance to racism as very much connected in terms of my coming to an understanding about politics. And at the same time, since it was the 60s, the counterculture was going on. And so I was receiving all kinds of information about different ways of being, different ways of living your life, different ways of relating to each other than the ones that my parents were offering me. And they offered all those things to me with the best of intentions, but I didn't really feel comfortable with that. They didn't resonate with me. I didn't know what, I had some idea that something was wrong. They didn't work for me, but I had no idea at first of what an alternative would be. So I was able to begin to explore those alternatives. I went to college in Brooklyn College, which was a tuition-free university. And that was the only reason I could go to college, really. And that was also very important for me as well, to understand the idea that college was, for most people, an elitist kind of experience. And even at the state universities, you had to pay a tuition. The City University of New York, of which Brooklyn College was a part, allowed you to have an education without having to be somebody of means and without having to take a job that might prolong your ability to follow through and even complete your education. So that was very significant that I was able to do that. Eventually, I went to NYU on a scholarship for graduate school. And NYU was located and still is located in the heart of Greenwich Village. And so I was in the center of the counterculture and the center of the anti-war movement and the center of the anti-racist movement that was going on in New York at the time. And so I couldn't help, by osmosis, be sort of aware of all these things. Of course, it was more than osmosis. I was curious, and I wanted to know how I could be part of that. It was very romantic in a way at first. I mean, I thought of myself as someone who could resist that and join the struggle which was the high road to ending war, ending racism, and all the rest. But the romance is what brought me into the nitty-gritty of, bringing it about and how to do it and what we could do to make that happen, whether it was, the kind of usual thing of protests and demonstrations or eventually direct action. And the direct action that I got involved in were what eventually led me to anarchism. So that I'm, very much, I see it as sort of a sequence of opening up in my case. I was able to open up to these ideas. I guess I had to be open to it to begin with, but I was willing to be open to it. And once I was, things started falling into place. And so I was able to continue to get college credits, graduate school credits, and dodge the draft. At the same time, I was resisting the draft and all of the capitalist institutions that it was based upon. And that was a precarious position. I worried about being drafted and what I would have to do to avoid being drafted every day of my life. I mean, it was constantly an anxiety in the back of my mind. So I was getting involved in these things partly because I had skin in the game. It wasn't some abstraction to me. And in that case, it was much more skin in the game than it would have been in terms of racism, because I didn't have direct experience of that. Even in terms of anti-Semitism, in the neighborhood I grew up in New York, since it was largely Jewish, probably about 70% Jewish. I didn't really experience anti-Semitism directly there in the neighborhood. It wasn't, and I'd of course heard about it. My parents would let me know what it was all about and the history of that in terms of the Holocaust and all the rest. But it wasn't the same as being directly affected by something that could actually mean I would be losing my life in a war or having to kill somebody for a reason that I didn't approve of at all. So that was partly that trajectory. Then eventually what I did was, since I was accumulating all these credits, they became a PhD, and I decided that I would want to teach at a university. And so I started applying to universities, and I taught for a couple of years in Utica College, which is in upstate New York. And that was kind of an introduction to me. I had a newborn child, and I needed a job. That was part of it. And I needed to kind of get some experience as a teacher. I had done some substitute teaching in high schools when I was getting my graduate degree. That substitute teaching was kind of something I enjoyed because it was hit and run. I wasn't part of a careerist kind of faculty there. I didn't have to get the approval of administrators. They basically wanted me to be there in the class, and they didn't really expect me to follow all of their rules. In fact, they were willing to look the other way when I didn't take attendance, and I would offer the students, a choice of one or two lessons. We would either be learning about the Vietnam War that day, or we would be learning about the struggle in Israel and Palestine. And so I've been doing kind of anti-war and anti-Zionist kind of stuff for 60 years, but I was doing it in the context of teaching in high schools to people who, this was a lot of, they were curious, the ones who stayed, the ones who, when I took attendance, was still there. When I didn't take attendance, were still there. And so we had some great discussions, and I began to learn things about teaching, and I found that I liked teaching. It was something that was enjoyable to me, and it was something that I felt I wish I would have had when I had been younger, because I had not gotten that in my educational experience. So then I went to, after Utica College, I went to teach at a place called Sangamon State University, which doesn't exist under that name anymore. It's now called the University of Illinois at Springfield, and it's located in Springfield, Illinois. But in those days, when it first started, which was in 1970, and I came there in 1972. In the early days, it was calling itself a radical state university. Let's put that in quotes, because how could a state university be completely radical? But it was certainly a lot more radical than a lot of the other universities that existed and that exist today. There were no grades, self-designed degrees, interdisciplinary programs. I taught in the Studies in Social Change program and the Justice and Social Order program. And the student body came from all over. It was an upper division school, which meant that you could start in your junior year. And so it was juniors, seniors, and master's students. And we had people transferring from universities all over the country coming there because they wanted this kind of experimental education. And that education was partly a response to the student movement, because in addition to the anti-war movement and intertwined with it was the student movement that I was part of when I had been in school, which wanted to change the elitist nature of universities, demystify education and professionalism, look at the whole idea of academia and question academia while at the same time embracing the idea of being intellectual and using your intellectual capabilities. So when offer like this came along, I was naturally going to be interested in it. And, to give you an idea of how different the times were then, I saw the ad for faculty in Rolling Stone magazine, which was in those days sort of much more interesting and more radically oriented magazine. And so I'm reading Rolling Stone, and there's this ad for a teaching position at Sangamon State explaining what it's like. And I'm going, yeah, this is what I'm looking for. And so I ended up moving to the Midwest. I'd never really been to the Midwest before at all. And I was living in Springfield, Illinois, and I was teaching in that university and meeting a lot of kindred spirits. And all through my life, I think, the meeting of kindred spirits has been really essential for my intellectual growth and for my growth politically and socially, and understanding of the world and understanding of myself, really. So at that university, I began to develop courses that I couldn't have done anywhere else. Like I taught probably one of the first anarchist courses at a university. And not only was it a university course about anarchism called Anarchism and Social Change, that was the name, but it was taught by an anarchist because by that time I was already identifying as an anarchist. So, in that sense, it was a groundbreaking kind of thing. And I was teaching courses in a variety of things that were connecting to that in my life. That would be cultural and political and social. And my life there was very much connected to also bringing more of a countercultural perspective to that place because Springfield was very much of a culturally conservative place. And so a lot of the people who came there to be part of Sangamon State University were trying to open that up. And all of a sudden, there were all these co-ops in Springfield. So there was a food co-op, and there was a daycare co-op, which I was one of the founders of in both cases. And there were all kinds of things happening that meant that there was an infrastructure being created. And I lived in outside of town in an old, really 100-year-old farmhouse, centennial farmhouse that was condemned. It was condemned because the city of Springfield had claimed the place through eminent domain, and they wanted to build an artificial lake there. And the artificial lake was there to serve the big box stores that surrounded Springfield, Illinois. And so I was living there during the time that they were trying to get this lake through. And I lived there by myself. I lived there with other people. I lived there in a variety of different living situations. And all the time we were resisting this lake that we were living there. We were fighting against the lake. We eventually won. They never built a lake. They ended up burning down the house, very dramatic. It was actually televised. A friend of mine saw it. I'd already left town by then, and that's sort of getting a little ahead of the story. But basically, we did lots of actions to prevent that lake from happening, and working in coalitions with other environmentalists and people who were taking various political positions who agreed on the idea that an artificial lake was certainly unnecessary. They were talking about building the lake and then creating artificial wetlands. So it didn't make any sense at all, except economic sense and a capitalist, understanding of things. And so we resisted that. I was very much involved in trying to understand what it was like to actually live rurally. So that was my first experience living in a rural area. I had grown up in New York City. I had moved to a small city, Utica, New York, and there I was now in Springfield and Illinois, and I was living in rural Illinois, growing my own food, doing the kinds of things that were involved in trying to be self-sufficient as well as self-determining, and to be involved in various kinds of actions that could be subversive, basically subverting ideas at university and subverting institutions that were oppressive. Because my whole understanding of anarchism is based on the idea, a very simple idea. It's not my original idea, of being opposed to all forms of domination. And so what I was trying to do was to subvert those and counter those in any ways that I could. And at the university, I was engaging in a variety of things that I began earlier when I was living in New York. So culturally, there was the counterculture, but a big part of my living in New York was different than most people's experiences of the counterculture. I was very deeply enmeshed in, since I lived at the heart of it, in the free jazz scene in New York. And I became very interested in Black music. At the same time, I became interested in Black liberation politics. And I carried that through when I moved to Illinois because I was living not far from Chicago. And I became interested in what was going on with the AACM, the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, which was a Black, self-determining group of musicians that lived in Chicago, and the BAG, the Black Artists Group in St. Louis. I was between the two cities, so I'd moved back and forth between those places. I immersed myself in that kind of culture, which I found to be very much reinforcing my ideas of wanting to be linking the two things that I mentioned as threads in my coming of age politically, which were the Black liberation movement and the anti-war movement in relation to Vietnam. And also it was out of sheer enthusiasm and enjoyment at the beauty of the music and the risks that people were taking to make that kind of music and to be that and the anarchist lessons I learned about improvisation in terms of direct action and everything else that came from my ability to see somebody like, let's say, John Coltrane when I was in New York, take apart a song and reassemble it in his own way. Because anarchy is always about destroying and constructing. You destroy what's oppressing you and you construct something new in its place, whether you're doing that as an individual, taking a jazz solo, or whether you're doing it with a group of individuals in mutual aid. And so I always saw the connection between individuality and community. That's a tension in all politics. How do you get those two things together in ways that in order to get one, you don't lose the other? How do you keep those things in the kind of balance that is fruitful to keeping things moving and to seeing growth and not stagnation, and to get out of the authority structures that so often come with stagnation? The other thing that happened for me when I was living in Springfield was that I was close to Chicago. And so I not only was hearing this music, but I was also became involved with the Chicago Surrealist group. And so my interests eventually crystallized into anarcho-surrealism, the connections between anarchy and surrealism. And this began during the time that I was living in Illinois. I met Franklin and Penelope Rosemont at a May Day demonstration in Chicago. And then we corresponded. I had been receiving Arsenal magazine, which was their surrealist magazine. And that eventually led to lots of connections I made with surrealists all over the world. And I'm still, connected to Penelope. She's still around. Franklin is no longer with us. But there's lots of young people involved in that movement as well. And it's very intergenerational. And surrealism has that kind of ability to kind of, it's a sense of becoming. It's not a dead end. And therefore, when I became involved with surrealism, it opened up another way of understanding how to be subversive and understanding what I could do to not only challenge things in the streets, but also to not only fight cops in the streets, but fight the cops in our heads, and how we combat authority in ways that are much more intimate. What is the revolution of the mind all about? That's something surrealism concerns itself with, as well as getting involved in things in the streets. And so that became important for me, an important vehicle for me in that aspect. The other thing that happened when I was at the University of Illinois at Springfield in the early days, Sangamon State. I'll keep referring to it as Sangamon State at this point because by the time it became U of I, it was Anywhere USA. It wasn't a very interesting place any longer. And I eventually left. But during my time there, one of the things about the university is that it was considered a very teaching-oriented place. it wasn't a publish or perish place, which was very attractive to me because, as I had mentioned earlier, I enjoyed teaching, and it was something that I fell in love with, really, and wanted to be in a place where that was the emphasis rather than an afterthought, where they weren't telling you you had to publish in so many academic journals. Otherwise, you were not going to be part of their university. So that was there, and I really put a lot of effort into it. I made that my main focus. But also eventually, when it got to be the 90s, which means I would have been there probably 20 years by then, I realized that I had something to say as an author, and I wanted to do some writing. And the first writing I did was Gone to Croatan, which was not so much my personal debut as a writer, because very little of that book involves me as a writer. I was mostly an editor of that book, an editor of other people's writings. And I did that with Jim Kinline, who did quite a bit of the writing in that book. But I began to make connections with other writers. I was beginning to see myself as a writer. And so that was an opening for me. And it was an opening to understanding a number of things that were, because it was a multicultural, multiracial history of the United States and North America. So it was an underground history, a hidden history, the kind of history that you don't learn in school. And when I was in Brooklyn College, I'd been a history major. So this all kind of fit with that connection that I had made earlier, and then coming to fruition with the publishing of this underground history book, which in some ways was, like Zinn's book, but going beyond it, going beyond the idea of focusing on history and at the same time not only going beyond it, but standing on its shoulders to do that, taking what I viewed as the next step. And so I was really thriving. I was also learning about indigenous cultures for the first time, because that was a part of that book. And that book really addressed that and addressed the idea of mixed race cultures made up of indigenous people, people who had been enslaved Africans, people who were indentured European servants who came together in the United States and in North America to resist their oppression and establish new ways of living. And so that was also very exciting to me to begin to make that exploration. I mentioned that was 1993 when that book came out. In 1992 was the quincentennial of Columbus's, quote, discovery of America. And I'd been very involved in the counter-quincentennial movement, working with the Alliance for Cultural Democracy, a number of indigenous groups and people who were anarchists and people of various political persuasions who essentially wanted to derail the big, party that was supposed to happen in 1992 to celebrate 500 years of Columbus discovering of America. And we managed to do that. I mean, they never got to really fully have that celebration. There was, in fact, what it was a vehicle for us to talk about what was really going on. And that's still being carried on today. And of course, today in the Trump administration, they're trying to repress that. They don't want that knowledge, that hidden history, to be part of public knowledge anymore. They would like to suppress it. So I began to kind of sort of see my interest get connected with my books. So the next book was about music, and I worked with a jazz musician by the name of Fred Ho, and it was called Sounding Off, and it was all about music as radical, as revolutionary, as subversive. And again, a collection of essays by myself and other people. So I began to do more writing. And then as I got more involved with the Chicago Surrealist Group, I was approached about doing a book with them which would publish a lot of material in one place that they had done and they had written in various places over the years. And so that became the book Surrealist Subversions. Now, all those books were written with Autonomedia. And Autonomedia was a publisher in New York City. And so this is what drew me back into the New York City circle. I began to come to Autonomedia meetings with other people doing books and other people on the editorial crew there. And I became to really be stimulated by those meetings and to become a part of that kind of intellectual scene in a way that I hadn't been when I actually lived in New York because I was too new to it. I was finding my feet in those days. I had not really, I didn't have solid ground for becoming part of something like that. But over the years, I had become somebody who felt comfortable in that situation and had something to offer, as well as all the things I had to learn. So it was a very much of a kind of bouncing off on each other's ideas and knowledge, and some of those relationships have lasted with me to this day. I have published with them as well as other publishers over the years. My most recent publications have been done with Eberhard Press in Portland, Oregon. And again, I mean, I basically have felt that I've been able to take some of my interests and some of my activist concerns, although the word activism is kind of a hollow word, it often means, I mean, what I mean by it is action, direct action. And so some of the things I'd been involved in that way were put into motion and eventually connecting to books that I would write on my own. So for Eberhard, I've written those books on my own, really. For Little Black Cart, the books that I've published with them, those have been my books and my writing. And unfortunately, Little Black Cart and Arden Press doesn't exist anymore. But I was maturing as a writer and now feeling comfortable as someone who was not just putting together books, which was almost like putting together lessons in a course. By editing books is a lot like that. I was now fully fledged as a writer and feeling confident in what I was writing about and feeling like I had something to say. And so that was a sort of a personal and political growth for me. And I felt like I was directly involved with these anarchist presses, Autonomedia, Little Black Cart, and Eberhard. Those are all significantly anarchist presses. So I've worked with these small press operations, and that's allowed me to be fully anarchist in them. My writing doesn't have to conform to sort of an editorial policy that would call for, quote, objectivity. I don't think anything's really objective, but I was able to kind of really draw upon all my interests in anarchy and in music and in all the things that were culturally important to me. I did a lot of culture jamming as well. One of my books was about pirate radio. I did that book for AK Press. And we had a pirate radio station in Springfield called Black Liberation Radio. And I was involved in that from the earliest days. The person who was doing that radio station in Bonacantako, who lived in the Black community in Springfield, had been doing tenant organizing, and they had been putting out a newspaper to try to raise people's consciousness, to kind of get people involved in the community. And at some point, they said, well, a lot of people don't read the newspaper. They're not used to getting their information from newspapers. I wonder if there's some other way that we can reach people. And I said, well, I know where we can get a radio transmitter. And so pretty soon, the radio transmitter arrived, and Umbano was doing the station out of his home. And it became a launching pad for the pirate radio movement in the United States. And after a while, there were 200 or more radio stations that came into being. These, of course, those, of course, were the days when people listened to radio more. And now people don't really listen to radio much. But in those days, they did. And I had been involved previously in a campus radio station at Sangamon State University. And that station ended up eventually throwing me off the air because we did a show which was, well, the background is there was a nuclear power plant that had been scheduled to open in nearby Clinton, Illinois, which was about 30 miles from where the university was. And a number of people had fought that, including myself. And before it actually opened, we thought we would do a theater piece, a radio theater piece, which involved a simulated nuclear power plant meltdown in Clinton, Illinois. And so we had a radio show that did radio theater. Students and faculty were involved in it in the Studies in Social Change program. We went on air and we gave a notice in advance saying, this is a simulation, this is not actually happening. And we mentioned that very, very clearly in the very beginning. But somehow, when it went on air, the person who was the station manager had turned on the radio or paid attention to what was on his station and realized what we were doing. He hadn't heard the initial kind of warning that this was a simulation. And he ran into the studio, ripped it off the air, shut us down. And of course, that just led to people to wonder what's really going on. Why are they not letting us know about what's happening at Clinton, Illinois? Now, remind you that the power plant wasn't even operative. This was before it even went into operation. But a lot of people got very upset about it. It was kind of a Orson Welles' War of the Worlds thing. And it became international news. The radio station, of course, didn't like the publicity. And, I was no longer doing radio. I had done a number of radio things with them, with music, with African music, with reggae music, with free jazz. Those were the things that I brought to the radio musically. But this was a project connected to anarchism, and people in studies in social change were a part of it. And so the idea of culture jamming, basically hijacking the culture and doing something else with it to show what's really going on, was something that I had been part of from the very beginning. I mentioned I had a child, and one of the reasons I moved to Utica, New York, was because I had a young child. And at the time when I arrived in Springfield, I was there during the time that my daughter grew up there. And a few years after arriving there, her mother and I had an amicable divorce. And we were raising the child together and living in separate households and so on. And my daughter was growing up, and it was a mind-blowing experience to me because I had never had any sisters. And I didn't know at all what it was like to grow up like a girl. Now, of course, I couldn't know that in the same way a girl could know it, but I saw the way the programming was trying to mold her and inhibit her and take away her power in a very direct way. And she became actually somebody at a young age who became involved in challenging those kind of things. In high school, she was a peer counselor for Planned Parenthood in high school. She'd read Our Bodies Ourselves, which I'd given her a copy of. We would do father-daughter things. Like, she just was visiting recently, and she reminded me that we'd altered a billboard for the Right to Life billboard in Springfield together, at one time when she was a teenager. I mean, but these were all ways in which I was coming to understand feminism, aside from the women around me letting me know, when I was full of shit. And that was important too. And so I was beginning to grapple with, these things, because there were things that were part of my experience. So very often I think you learn in school things that are important, but a lot of times learning happens outside of school. And so there I was at the university, um, teaching people who wanted to learn about anarchism in a university setting. And I thought, okay, these are the people who want to learn about this in the university, and I'm willing to do that. I'm enjoying doing that, but at the same time realizing that you could learn about anarchism on your own by reading. You could learn about it in the streets by becoming involved in direct action. You could learn about it in prison if you're, got a lot of time on your hands and want to do some reading and thinking about, those kinds of issues. So I saw myself as working with a particular group of people who wanted to learn about anarchy, but I was learning about it through the connections I was making. And so I was involved when I was in Springfield with uh, a radical therapy group, which was basically challenging a lot of psychological assumptions. So it was concerned with anti-psychiatry, but it was also concerned with the way in which people are confined by therapy, and therapy often involves getting you to adjust to things that really you should be rebelling against. And so rebellion was always part of my MO. And I basically thought, okay, well, this is a place that interested me. And there were women in that group that were challenging a lot of the assumptions of patriarchy. There were challenges to the whole idea of sexuality and heterosexuality. And all of those things were useful for me in understanding myself, as well as thinking about how I might act in the world to be a voice for change and to be somebody who wants to make these things that I was passionate about happen if they were things that I was working towards, or prevent them from happening if I thought they were things that were pulling us all down and pulling people I knew personally down. So I always see those things, those two things as connected, the personal and the political. And feminism definitely was making a point about that connection that resonated with me. So I don't think that people become anarchists necessarily because one day they wake up and say, "Oh, I had this epiphany. I'm an anarchist." It's a gradual process for a lot of people. It was a gradual process for me. And eventually what I realized in all of these actions that I was involved in all of these movements that I was involved in, the people that I would sort of feel closest to, the ideas that I would resonate most with, the places that I would feel most at home were the anarchist ones. And so anarchy just seemed like not something that I said to myself one day, well, I think I want to be an anarchist, and I think there are 5 steps you have to follow, and I'll do these things and become an anarchist. It was more like I recognized myself as an anarchist. And I think that's in a way a deeper way of coming to anarchy. And even the idea of coming to anarchy sounds kind of weird. It sounds like coming to Christ or something. It's not about that as coming to a religious experience of faith. It's much more connected to the idea of coming to a place where you begin to question everything, not only in the larger world, but within anarchism itself, and making distinctions between anarchy and anarchism even. So I became very much interested in reading everything I could, in talking to people who had more knowledge than me. And so those were the places I gravitated towards, because I worked with lots of different people coming from different places in lots of the things I was doing. And so I found I found my people, when I was doing anarchy. And eventually there were a number of North American anarchist gatherings, one in particular that happened in Chicago in 1986 was commemorating the Haymarket anarchists of 1886. And when I went to that and became involved in some of the things that grew out of that, I really felt a connection, because I'd never been in a group of that many anarchists coming together to talk about things, to do things, and to kind of reflect on who they were and where they wanted to see things go in a very open and honest way. And that was incredibly influential on me. I also went to that gathering with Jim Kenline, the person I did Contra Croatan with, and in a way that was the beginnings of that book, which is something that led me to a variety of different places. So I still am involved in anarchist gatherings today. I now live on Denman Island, and after, a couple of days after arriving on Denman, I went to an anarchist gathering on Denman. But that's a longer story of how I got to Denman. And I could say that when I was in Springfield, Illinois, I knew that that place wasn't working for me as the university became more entrenched. And yeah, after all, the state legislature was pulling the strings. It was a state university. And at some point, they wanted to make it a more conservative place. They wanted to bust the faculty union, which was a fairly radical union of its kind, wanting to preserve the radical impetus of the university. And they wanted to eliminate the union, which they did in a way by making it part of the larger University of Illinois system. And things were headed in that direction. And I knew I wanted to leave. And I was the kind of person that not only wanted to teach my heresy in the classroom, but to bring it out into the streets as well. So the university really didn't like that, increasingly didn't like that. To me, it was consistent. What I did as a teacher and I did in the community was consistent. And I think that's an important thing in terms of anarchy, the idea of your values being connected to what you want to see happen in the world and the way you go about it. And so I saw that as sort of drying up, those kinds of possibilities as beginning to dry up. My daughter had already grown up. I had wanted to stay in Springfield in that area while she was growing up, to be there for her. And it was time to kind of think of leaving. I didn't know where I wanted to go. People would ask me because they knew I wanted to leave Springfield. I'd been there 30 years. And they wanted to know where I was headed next. And I said, I don't know, that place hasn't presented itself to me yet, until it did. It did in a very kind of dramatic way. I had been part of, in terms of counterculture and all the rest, I've been very deeply involved in the zine culture and mail art network. And one of the zines I got was an anarchist zine from Portland, Maine. And that zine was called Black Star North. And in it, I read an article by a Czech surrealist that had been translated into English about Czech surrealism. And at that time, I was interested in not only anarchy, but surrealism. And so I contacted the publication, I forget the name of the person who was doing it, but I contacted that person and said, hey, are there any more of these articles around? I'd be really interested in reading more of these translations. And he said, well, I don't know. I got that article from some zine in Canada. I don't know where. Let me look it up. He looks it up in it. British Columbia somewhere, in a place called Denman Island. And I thought, oh, okay. Well, I'll contact this person on Denman Island. And I sort of put it in my head, but then really didn't think a lot about it because Denman Island seemed far away. And shortly thereafter, though, I read an article in Kick It Over, which was an anarchist newspaper that came out of Toronto. It was by a guy by the name of Gary Moffat. And it was about, he was a long-term fixture on the Toronto anarchist scene. And he had left to go to a place called Denman Island. And he wrote about how great Denman Island was, and it was fulfilling his anarchist dreams. And I thought, okay, I gotta contact this guy who did the zine Minus Tides, which was coming out of Denman. And I contacted him. Sean Woods is his name. And you've interviewed him, actually, as one of these interviews you've done for this series. And I said, Sean, I'd like to, come out to and meet. Why don't we get together? And I'd like to check out Denman Island. At that time, I didn't think, well, I'm going to move to Denman Island. I just thought it'd be an interesting place, whether I move there or not. I'd like to check it out. I heard so much about it, and it seems to be a hotbed of anarchy and surrealism, my two passions, right? So I called Sean. We got together. We hit it off. He put me in touch with other anarchists on the island. I came out with my partner, Sheila Knopper, who was Canadian. And so she felt right at home in Canada. She had come down to the States to live with me in Springfield for 7 years. And we were both thinking, well, maybe we'll move to Canada. So that was a possibility. And we met all these people. They wined us and dined us and basically told us we could find a home there and did find a place for us to rent before we left. And so 3 months later, at lock, stock, and barrel, we moved to Denman Island. And so when I came to Denman, to sort of get back to where I took this tangent, a couple of days after I arrived, there was an anarchist gathering that happened. And it was the first one that happened on Denman. But there was a small anarchist community, and it was a way of growing the community. It was a way about finding kindred spirits. And people came up from Vancouver, particularly, some from Victoria. And a lot of those people ended up coming later and staying and moving there. And so we became a bigger anarchist community on Denman. Denman is a much larger community. It was about 1,000 people in those days. So the anarchist community is much smaller than that, but we were a significant part of the community and very visible and increasingly visible over the years. And certainly compared to the other Gulf Islands, Denman Island is one of the Gulf Islands which is connected to the San Juan Islands in the States, in the northwest part of the States. There's just a border that runs through it, but it's basically the same archipelago. Denman Island has the largest kind of anarchist scene or community of any of those islands. And so I, began to work on putting together other anarchist communities and other anarchist gatherings. We had one as recently as a couple of summers ago that I was part of. So we've done several over the years, and it's a great way of getting to know people, not just in a passing way, but to spend a weekend with them, and then since we were nearby, maybe having them visit on occasion and getting a connection to each other that allowed movement back and forth. Because I've always felt a need to be able to move in both worlds, the rural world and the urban world. And I feel one of the things about growing up in New York and then living in rural areas is that it's allowed me to feel comfortable in moving in both of those worlds. And so when I was on Denman, when I came to Denman, I basically brought certain things with me. We started a pirate radio station. And that created a sort of autonomous zone that didn't exist before on the island. We began to do the kinds of things that built on what was already there, because Denman is a place that, in name, might not call itself anarchist, but has various things that go on the island that are very anarchist in substance. So there's a free store. There's a volunteer fire department. There's a free shack. There are various ways that people assist each other in emergency situations, deaths, and births. There are meal trains for the families that have newborn babies. There's a whole concept of mutual aid that exists on Denman in practice that many of the people practicing it wouldn't necessarily call themselves anarchists, but they're doing things that are very anarchist. And in a way, that's even better. You don't need the label, necessarily to value the substance, right? And so we decided that's something, we wanted to build on. I was beginning to get more involved in surrealism. We established the Inter-Island Surrealist Group. Um, and Denman Island, in the indigenous name of Denman Island, is Inner Island. So that's not a translation that's of Denman Island. Denman Island is the colonial name. Admiral Denman came along for the British Empire and pointed his cannons at the island and said, "We claim this for the British Empire." Inner Island is the indigenous name that was given by the Pentlatch people who were here originally. And so we did things with that even off island. So a nearby town to where we lived is Cumberland. Cumberland is on Vancouver Island. Denman is a little island off Vancouver Island, and Cumberland is a town nearby to where you would enter Vancouver Island if you took the ferry over from Denman. And we got involved there in thwarting and hijacking an Empire Day celebration. They were actually, it was one of the few places in Canada that actually continued to celebrate Empire Day up until just recently. And so Empire Day was celebrating the connection between Canada and the British Empire. And they would have an annual parade and people would get days off and all of that. And so we thought, yeah, we have to subvert this in some way. Now, Cumberland had previously been a coal mining town. And as a coal mining town, it had a very radical history, a very radical union history. Ginger Goodwin was a miner who was very involved in radical organizing. And it had this kind of history that involved large May Day parades down the main street, Dunsmuir Street on Denman Island. Not on Denman Island, but in Cumberland. And so we wanted to recall that history because, in a way, the Empire Days Parade had been established in order to short circuit that history, to bury that history. And instead of having that May Day Parade, there was now an Empire Days Parade. So we sort of unofficially joined the parade by just jumping in. And we handed out, we did a lot of anti-coal kind of street theater. I've always done a lot of street theater in my time. I did it at May Day parades in Minneapolis, and where they have huge May Day parades. And so we were able to kind of subvert the kind of idea that this was a replacement for May Day celebration. But we also, at the same time, wanted to bring surrealism into it. And so we handed out fortune cookies that we had made up in advance by sort of prying the little fortunes out and inserting very carefully a new fortune. And the new fortune said, transform dreams of empire into the empire of dreams. And we put that in the fortune cookie, and we gave that out to kids along the way. And of course, they wanted the fortune cookie. And their parents, said, "Oh, fortune cookie." So kids take it home, or, they open it up and, "Mom, what's this mean?" So it hopefully opened up some conversations. And we were able to kind of do a number of things that would cause a questioning of things that have been taken for granted. We weren't anti-parade or anti-celebration or anti-getting a day off from work. Those are all good things. But what is the parade all about? What do we really want to celebrate? We don't want to celebrate empire. And they basically don't have an Empire Day official celebration there anymore. They have something like a parade, but it isn't really this kind of Empire Days emphasis to it. That's a thing of the past now. So we also did a Funeral of Empire art exhibit, the Inter-Island Surrealist Group, that happened during that time. So we did a number of things. I mean, if you're wondering what a surrealist action, an anarcho-surrealist action might be, that's the kind of thing we would do, right? So, all of these things were things that we were able to kind of bring to a place like Denman. and they were welcomed, and we would at the same time be learning new things from people here. Musically, I was able to bring a lot of my background in terms of music. I did radio, I did an African music show, or a music show that had a lot of African music on it. I DJ'd African dances. I've DJ'd dances for 30 years now, maybe 40. So it's not, I mean, DJing is nothing new, and still do. I did a couple just within the last few months. So um, I think that, and they're intergenerational. So I like the idea that I'm at a place now where a lot of these threads of my life are coming back together, and having this perspective of trying to respond to your questions in sort of putting them together in some way in my head has enabled me to look back and see how those threads all connect. And I'm sure I left a lot out, but that's kind of the basics at this point. I probably have run my mouth long enough anyway.